Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Mustafa Qadri. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Equidem, a human rights organisation committed to advancing labour rights and human rights globally. Equidem employs a unique approach. We don't just expose injustice, we provide solutions, seek to build the human rights movement, and the people whose rights we fight for are also key members of our team. This helps us to bridge the gap between the international and grassroots human rights movement. Equidem focuses on innovative, rigorous, evidence-based advocacy and campaigns. We are specialists in exposing injustice in high surveillance and sensitive contexts, whether it's mega projects, global supply chains, or industries at the heart of the just transition. Today, we are releasing our report, Unjust Transitions, Climate Migration, Heat Stress, and Labour Exploitation in the United Arab Emirates, on the eve of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP28, that at the end of this month will be held in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. The shining facilities at Expo City, Dubai, boast internationally celebrated solar and wind parks, and the country has a booming gig economy with investments from the United States, Europe, and China. Underneath that cheerful exterior, however, women and men from some of the poorest countries on earth are being subjected to serious human rights abuses in a nation whose oil and gas-powered economy is at the heart of the planet's climate crisis. Equidem investigations reveal that workers at the heart of the United Arab Emirates renewable and gig sectors and at the site that will host COP28 have left homes in Africa and Asia because of climate change, only to be subjected to physical abuse, heat stress, exploitation, and discrimination. Right now, I'm speaking to you this morning from Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, because it is arguably the single most important political and economic ally of the United Arab Emirates, and because a meeting like this could not take place in the Emirates itself, a country that persecutes individuals and groups on the basis of their opinions, beliefs, and identity, and where workers who dare to organize or complain are exploited and criminalized. Today, I'm very lucky to be joined by a really great panel. With me here in Washington, D.C. is JJ Rosenbaum, the Executive Director of Global Labour Justice International Labour Rights Forum. Online, we also have other speakers with us. We have two people from some of the most climate-affected parts of the world, Cynthia Nyaboke in Kenya and Mohammad Ali in Pakistan. They belong to communities who have been deeply impacted by the climate crisis, resulting in workers travelling to the United Arab Emirates and facing exploitation in the process. And if we have an opportunity, we'll be also joined by Leah Whitson, the Executive Director of Democracy for the Arab World. I'll now briefly go through the findings of our report, and then we'll open it to our panel discussion for reflections from my colleagues and friends on the panel. But firstly, to go through the investigations. Our investigations were carried out between February and October 2023, so it's a very recent set of data that we've collected. Our investigations covered Expo City, Dubai, and also the renewable and delivery sectors, including at Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Solar Park, Al Dhafra Solar Park Project, Noor Abu Dhabi Solar Plant, Sir Bani Yaz Wind Farm Project, and of course across the United Arab Emirates as well. Our research is based on discussions with 248 workers and detailed interviews with 102. Our report offers unprecedented insight into the renewables, construction, security, and delivery sectors in the United Arab Emirates. It's very difficult to understate how challenging it is to do independent human rights research in a place like the Emirates, where even a small whiff of people talking to outsiders about even simple human rights abuses can lead to quite severe criminal sanction. And so we're very proud of the light that we're shedding on both industrial and service sector working conditions for 9 million workers in migrant workers in the United Arab Emirates. Incredibly, they make up around 90% of the total population in that country. There are so many takeaways from our report, and I really encourage you to go through it. It's a very large report. It'll be available on our website, and we'll provide details at the end of the launch on how you can see it. But some of the key takeaways to share with you now: 57% of the migrant workers that we interviewed come from climate-impacted areas of Asia and Africa. 41% of the workers reported nationality-based discrimination. 77% of the workers interviewed in the renewable sector reported living in overcrowded accommodation with up to 20 people in a room, fit for 6 or fewer workers, a clear contravention of Emirates law. And 83% of the African and Asian workers interviewed reported being unable to afford nutritious and healthy food. Amazingly, 40% of the workers said that they were routinely skipping meals. This in one of the wealthiest countries on earth. Workers interviewed by Equidem migrated for employment to the United Arab Emirates from many countries across Asia and Africa, including the Philippines, Mozambique, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal. These are 5 of the 10 countries most affected by climate change based on the data that's available between the years 2000 and 2019. Migrant workers in the Emirates, therefore, are doubly impacted by the global climate crisis. They migrate in response to climate impacts and find employment in exploitative industrial and service contexts where they work long hours in extreme heat. Hosting the peak global conference in a climate and rights abusing state was bad enough. But Equidem's research starkly reveals that the United Arab Emirates is failing on almost every metric of the UN's own human rights benchmarks for addressing climate change through the COP process. Abuses include workplace violence, wage theft, working in extreme heat and other occupational health and safety risks, nationality-based discrimination, exploitative hiring practices, understaffing and overwork, lack of opportunities for promotion, overcrowded accommodation, inadequate food allowances, and inadequate channels for workers to seek relief for these violations. These rights violations take place against a backdrop of racially delineated exclusion from labour rights protections, denial of freedom of association, and authoritarian suppression of dissent in the United Arab Emirates. It is by no means an easy feat to independently do this kind of research. As I noted earlier, the United Arab Emirates is very hostile to independent human rights monitoring. I therefore want to make a special mention to Equidem's brilliant, brave, and dedicated team of experts, our researchers, our investigators, and the rest of the team that has made today possible. And especially, of course, the workers and the communities that we interviewed in the United Arab Emirates, Africa, and Asia. But particularly our investigators and the workers that we meet. They work and speak to us under great risk and sacrifice so much so that women and men, ordinary people like us, simply looking for a better life out of poverty for themselves and their families, have a voice to tell the world how climate change and low-wage work in global supply chains is destroying lives. I'd also like to make it clear that we haven't just documented violations, as significant as that is. We've provided very clear, concrete recommendations and solutions to governments, to businesses, and to the United Nations around how to address these shocking practices. To the United Arab Emirates government, we call on them to end its discriminatory and restrictive foreign employment system in line with international human and labour rights conventions, reform and enforce climate and other occupational health and safety protections, respect freedom of association and collective bargaining rights for all workers, and enforce forced labour and human trafficking laws, and address gaps in migrant worker access to justice. Migrant worker origin states, we call on them to protect workers from exploitation in the recruitment process, work with the United Arab Emirates authorities, business and other stakeholders to ensure access to justice and remedies, and place migrant worker rights and labour rights at the centre of your engagement in the COP climate process. To businesses, we call on them to comply with international human and labour rights protections in the absence of protections under Emirates law, ensure workers can exercise their right to freedom of association, right to organise, engage in collective bargaining and collective representation and freedom of speech. And we also call on businesses to divest from projects where partners in the United Arab Emirates fail to address human and labour rights abuses. And finally, to the United Nations. We call on the United Nations to centre climate negotiations around human and labour rights, including with respect to the Loss and Damage Fund, and require human rights and climate-related requirements to host COP meetings in the future. Finally, we call on the UN authorities to also investigate human rights and exploitation that we've documented in our report. In the absence of addressing these critical responses to the climate crisis, the United Arab Emirates, the international community, and businesses are leading our planet to an unjust transition that entrenches and exacerbates existing inequalities. It's also bad for the people of the United Arab Emirates and the wider Arab Gulf region. Unless there are drastic and urgent efforts made to transition away from oil and gas and meet the 1.5-degree Paris Climate Conference target, the Emirates itself and the wider Arabian Peninsula will be uninhabitable in our lifetimes. So our work is as much a plea to save these culturally rich, diverse and ancient societies as it is a plea to respect the inherent dignity of the women and men without whom the Emirates' shining cities and facilities would not exist. I would like to thank you again for joining our report launch. Like I said, it's a very detailed report, and I really encourage you to look through that, and there'll be a chance for questions and answers at the end of today. But I would like to first ask my friends Cynthia and Mohammad Ali, like I said, people from some of the most climate-affected parts of the world, to join our discussion. So I'll start with Cynthia Nyaboke. As I mentioned, she lives in one of the most climate-impacted parts of Kenya. And until last year, she was a migrant worker in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. Jumbo, Cynthia, can you hear me?
Jumbo, hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, and you?
Very good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you, Cynthia.
Okay, thank you. Hello, I'm Jumbo. My name is Cynthia Nyaboke. I'm 25 years old, and until last year, I was a migrant worker in the United Arab Emirates. I come from Murang'a County, whose main economic activity is agriculture, which accounts to over 60% of employment in our locality. Our main farming system is cash crops farming, livestock keeping, and fish rearing in both large scale and small scale. I went to Dubai for a work due to reducing yield in our small farm. My parents could not afford to provide for us adequately. This was because of soil degradation because of repeat farming and natural calamities like floods, which caused soil erosion, thus making the land more unproductive. My parents provided the rescuement fee equivalent to 800 US dollar for my process of traveling to Dubai, and they had so much high expectation from me to change to change our economic situation in the family. However, when I reached Dubai, I found totally different environment from working for a very long hours, substandard food, and working under very humid conditions. The salary was small, 1,200 dirham per month, which is around 300 US dollar, with a shift of 10 hours per day for 6 days in a week. I used to have recurring headache every time, and the worst of it all was that when you are given a sick off, it was deducted from your wage, which is against existing labor laws. In summary, having a people-centered approach ensures inclusion, representation, and protection of the victims like us, migrant workers. So I would like to urge delegates and key players at COP28 summit to remember workers from Africa who have contributed least to emissions and are suffering unjustly and unfairly, yet we turn out to be the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Asante Sana. Really appreciate your powerful words. And we will return to you during our panel discussion. I'd like now to turn to Muhammad Ali. He lives in, again, one of the most climate impacted parts of Pakistan. And many of the men and some of the women from his region have traveled to the United Arab Emirates for work, only to face exploitation and heat stress. Salam alaikum, Muhammad Ali.
Wa alaikum salam. Are you fine?
I'm very good, alhamdulillah. Hope you're well.
Uh,
Over to you, Muhammad Ali. Thank you.
Fine, I'm fine. Thank you, Mustafa, for joining.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Please, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, please.
Muhammad Ali, can you tell us a little bit about how climate change has impacted your community and why, because of that climate change, many of your own family and your community are traveling in desperation to the United Arab Emirates?
It's so clearly that in 2010, when the flood came across, and they flushed off all of my village, and all of the houses and all of the community were in the under the sky. There was no shelters, no homes. That was a very great moment for the people, and they moved toward the mountains, and they lay down under the sun and the sky. For that, it was a difficult moment for the youngsters, for the children, and for the adults. And there was no shelters, no food resources. Even there are so many were sick on the spot. So for that, the only survival in my region were the only agriculture, and the second was second was the tourism, and the tourism also affect because there was no bridges, no roads, and no food security over there because of agriculture. all of the land were escaped by the flood. But there were no human resource, so that people all of my mostly family members moved toward UAE for the sake of money, for the sake of food, for the sake of shelter. While I can explain, it's very hard. It was totally hard that I have when I live under the sun at 20 degrees and I move to UAE for 40 and 50 degrees centigrade, while the temperature changes the skin colors and it destroys my skin, and I have to migrate for the sake of food and shelter. While working in the UAE, it's difficult for me because I have no language, I have no laws, I don't know about the laws of the, and there a great problem which I have faced, that is accommodation, because a sample room, which can be only adopted by 3 or 4 person, they have beds and they were overlying one another, and mostly 14 to 15 people were lived. There's no social security, no language outside of the people, no hygienic problem is almost, because at a place where there's noise, no sleeping position is not good. It makes the person mentally retired, because the low space and under the one and the second, it make a depression for the people. Uh, it's a great problem. When the most problem that we faced early, that there's job security. No, there were no jobs. If I got a job, it's only I can live by the pay. At the end of the month, I have no money to so that I could take them to the village, to the Pakistan, or I could live on behalf of that money at UAE. The people live there have no local transport because they don't know how to punch their cards, because there's ignorance, there's no educated people there. Almost the people goes there with no education, lack of education. The lack of education is because of no position here. It's a difficult time for us. I urged, and second, heat strokes. Some of the people let down because they can't work because of the temperature. While the temperature in Pakistan and the temperature in the UAE or some other countries, they are so the people are worried about how to work. Should I work or should I lay here? Should I pay to the Pakistan for them? How can I support my families there? It's very difficult for me. I urge to the world that please, because of this floods, in every year the flood comes from the area and it flushes all of the villagers. Uh, People can't survive. It's a great problem to hear in Pakistan and as well in the other countries. So that's very difficult for us. So people should face to the Pakistani peoples.
Thank you, Muhammad Ali. Really appreciate you again joining us today, and really, really powerful words. And, you know, when you hear from Cynthia and Muhammad Ali, for example, that the United Arab Emirates is per capita one of the greatest contributors to carbon dioxide emissions. But you can see, and it comes out in our research, that there is a direct link between their role in climate change and the impacts not only in the countries where workers that are in the Emirates come from, but of course in destroying the local economy and society, and then placing them in vulnerability and desperation that can lead to more exploitation in the Emirates. I think it's something for us to really be thinking about in terms of what's happening when our climate process is being driven by these sorts of states and economies, and they're actually hosting the event that's meant to be saving our planet. So like I said, we'll come back to Cynthia and Mohammed during our group discussion, but I wanted to now turn to JJ Rosenbaum from Global Labour Justice International Labour Rights Forum to give some of her thoughts on our work. Thanks, JJ.
Thank you, Mustafa. And I'd like to start by recognizing Equidem's expertise and leadership in bringing forward this very important report and very cutting-edge information, and particularly to Cynthia and to Mohammad Ali and to all the other workers and investigators with Equidem that worked tirelessly to bring forward these stories under very difficult conditions with their direct experiences as workers and as part of migrant communities. And I want to recognize the courage that they're showing as labor rights defenders and bringing this information forward. As Mustafa said, my name is JJ Rosenbaum. I'm the Executive Director of Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum, a Washington, D.C.-based civil society organization that works closely with workers, unions, and migrant organizations to advance international labor standards, including freedom of association and collective bargaining, and the prevention of gender-based violence and harassment. Our work pays particular attention to access to decent work for low-wage workers on global supply chains. And that's for that reason we're very interested in both the findings and the recommendations that Equidem has brought forward today. And I'm also a lecturer on social justice issues and labor migration at the Harvard Law School. You may have heard of it. As we read in the report, and as we've heard testified to directly today, workers are exposed to dangerous and exploitative working conditions on a regular basis in their work in the UAE. And I want to just list the conditions again to make sure that we've heard them as Mustafa laid them out, and recognize that these conditions, in most part, violate national law in the UAE. They violate international labor standards from the ILO and the UN, and they violate the voluntary corporate social responsibility statements of the corporate and investor actors that are involved. So workers are working extended hours, exposed to incredible heat without a break on a weekly basis from 60 to 80 hours a week. Other health and safety violations include no paid sick leave, dangerous working conditions that are leading to death, inhumane accommodations, and food. Wage theft is rampant, including non-payment of wages, underpayment of wages and overtime, irregular and delayed payments, underpayment of contractually promised wages, and serious wage stagnation. It's reported that some workers have not received an increment or a raise since 2017, despite incredible inflation and devaluing of currencies in their home countries. So we can imagine what amount of purchasing power workers' wages are leaving them with. Violence and harassment at work, including gender-based violence and harassment, conditions that rise to forced labor, including the holding of identity documents, coercive debts to employers, and deceptive recruitment practices, ineffective employer and government grievance mechanisms, and very importantly, threats of and actual retaliation when workers come forward and organize collectively. So for the purpose of today's discussion, I'd like to emphasize three main takeaways from this important research that are critical to worker empowerment and labor rights, including how heat exposure, the kafala labor migration system, and legal prohibitions on trade unions, freedom of association and collective bargaining make this pattern of abuse very predictable. This might be disheartening. It is disheartening, we should say, but this is a particularly timely discussion given the release last week in the United States of the Biden administration's groundbreaking executive memorandum on advancing worker empowerment, rights, and high labor standards, which emphasizes that globally, worker empowerment is essential to development, just transition, and labor migration with decent work. And it sets forth a whole of government approach in the United States and a prioritization of labor rights among US agencies working globally towards advancing worker empowerment, organizing workers' rights and labor standards globally. So what we're hearing today is both a definition of the problem, but we also have, as of last week, a very new and important tool that can help guide our response for actors in the United States. So first, migrant workers in the UAE report triple vulnerability to extreme heat and exposure in this report. In their home countries, they're in climate vulnerable situation, which is driving distressed migration. In the UAE, they're being exposed to incredible temperatures for significant periods of time, as we've heard today. And in the way the jobs are structured, they're being exacerbated to heat exposure and avoiding even the very basic, insufficient rules regarding breaks, access to water, et cetera. As Equidem's research shows, the majority of workers are from countries including Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, other countries in Africa, which are extremely climate vulnerable in their home countries. And as the Equidem report has found, migrant workers are being doubly impacted by the global climate crisis. This is a quote from the report, so go and find it on the website. They migrate in response to climate impacts, and they find employment in exploitative industrial and service contracts where they work long hours in extreme heat. So this is the first point. The second point, the kafala system for labor migration under which workers migrate, which ties them to one employer who controls their work, their ability to leave the country. This system compounds low-wage working conditions, facilitates retaliation, and is itself structural exploitation up to and including forced labor. As Mustafa said in his remarks, reminded us the UAE has a population of 9.8 million people, only 11% of whom are citizens. So that means 9 million migrant workers are building the country, are servicing people who live there, and are the foundation on which this country is operating. This is not a small side problem. This is fundamental to the structure of the economy. Under the kafala system, companies sponsor visas and control, again, workers' ability to work, their ability to change jobs, and even their ability to quit and leave the country. Extensive research has shown that much of it conducted by Equidem and many others also, that the kafala system facilitates repression of labor rights violation and facilitates retaliation, including deportation and blacklisting of workers who come forward to raise complaints. The labor migration regime also structures work as temporary in a way that further displaces risk onto workers who fear reporting labor violations because they need more working hours, contract renewals, et cetera, to earn back the money that they paid in recruitment fees and to support their families on the subsistence wages. On this point, it's also important to note that in addition to wage theft, again, as I mentioned, workers are facing massive wage stagnation. This is what this report shows, which just compounds the vulnerability at every stage of this process. And my third and final point, without robust recognition of trade unions, freedom of association, and collective bargaining, which are fundamental labor rights, which all countries in the world are accountable to, workers will not have the ability to monitor, report, and remedy violations of labor rights without fear of retaliation, and this pattern of exploitation will continue. This has been highlighted in the US State Department Human Rights Report for 2022, which notes significant human rights issues, including the outlawing of independent trade unions and significant restrictions on workers' freedom of association in the UAE. So where do we go from here? This report and this conversation is a start and a very important one because we have and we're hearing directly from workers who are impacted by the situation and who have very up-to-date information. This is, I think, what the Biden administration means in its report, in its executive memorandum released last week when it says we need to bring workers to the table. This is the first start of how we do this. And so for this, we really recognize Equidem's expertise and work. It's not an easy thing. I'd just like to emphasize a few additional points, which I think we can take up in the discussion, many of which are covered by Equidem's recommendations in the report. The first is that just transition, migration, and worker empowerment are linked together, and we need to discuss them that way. The second, protections for labor rights defenders is critical for them to expose what is happening and to bring forward and participate in the discussions at the table. And the third is that just transition requires that governments in home countries and destination countries and in the home countries of multinational corporations and investors be held accountable for labor rights violations across their supply chains. This is not a situation where there is not enough money available to pay workers a living wage, to have decent conditions at work. This is a situation where that money is being extracted out by multinational corporations, by investors who are getting very rich off of this system while workers are struggling in the ways that we've discussed. And all governments along the labor migration supply chain and along the global values chains need to be responsible for these conditions and for the outcome for workers. Thank you.
Thank you, JJ, for your really thoughtful reflections on our work. And again, just to emphasize, JJ and her team are real leading experts on international labor rights. So it's really great to get those thoughts. There are so many things to unpack, what we've already discussed. But before we do, I wanted to turn to Sarah Leah Whitson, Executive Director of Democracy in the Arab World Now, also does incredible work on human rights defenders and civic freedom in the United Arab Emirates. Hi, Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. How are you?
Brilliant. Yeah, very good. How are you? You well?
Good.
Excellent. Over to you, Sarah.
All right. I hope the camera is clear. I can't see anything from this angle. I see why now. So thank you to Equidem for putting out this incredibly important yet incredibly disheartening report. It's particularly distressing to me in 2023 to see that we are grappling with some of the same issues about labor exploitation, labor abuse, labor oppression in the UAE as we were in 2006 when I and my colleagues at Human Rights Watch released the first report on the abuse and exploitation of migrant workers in the country. It is extremely distressing to me that this completely man-made problem that is overwhelmingly a problem of economics and penny pinching by one of the world's richest governments is still confronting the same types of issues from wage exploitation and wage theft, from inordinate working hours, from refusing to implement a ban on work during high heat hours, from passing laws that are paper tigers, like the laws imposing federal standards on housing, from the laws that are supposed to prohibit charging workers recruiting fees, prohibit having workers work overtime, prohibit sanctioning workers who dare to complain about their conditions. We are seeing all of those realities continue today as Mustafa has pointed out, some of the most ironic ways where victims of climate change from some of the most impacted countries in the world are now working in countries in the UAE where they continue to suffer the consequences of climate change. I think it's very important that Mustafa emphasized that we are having this press conference in Washington, D.C. in the National Press Club for a very important reason, and that is that the UAE is a U.S.-backed, U.S.-protected state, receives purchases inordinate quantities of weapons, in fact, is one of the largest weapons purchasers in the world, has U.S. military forces present in the UAE, and receives a lot of political protection from the United States. So it's completely appropriate that this press conference is happening in the United States, which is a key enabler of many of the abuses that we see in the UAE, not just domestically, with the continued persecution of anyone who dares speak critically, really about any subject. Even pro-Palestine protests and expressions of support have been completely curtailed at this moment, to say nothing of the ongoing war in Yemen and the UAE's occupation of Socotra Island in Yemen. The reason we're having this press conference in DC, however, and not in the UAE, where we should be addressing the UAE government, because it is the principal actor, the principal violator here, is because it is not allowed. And in the buildup to UAE COP28, which is supposed to be about an open and frank discussion of the damages and harms and action for climate, including civil society, including the free participation in civil society. In fact, there is no free participation of civil society, and a press conference like this would never be permitted in the UAE. And so it is deeply troubling that the international community has bended to the will of the UAE to host COP28 in a country not only that restricts free expression and free association, that would never permit a press conference like this, that has personally deported me when I tried to enter the UAE because of our work documenting migrant worker abuses, has made it so difficult for organizations like Equidem even to talk to workers who have been so brutally impacted, that it is the place where we are unable to have this conversation. And instead, we see a country where freedom of association is prohibited, where collective bargaining and unionization are clearly prohibited. Now, we all know the whole world over, the best way to protect worker rights, the best way to protect the many who are otherwise powerless from the few who are powerful is to have unions and to allow labor association. But the reason the UAE doesn't allow this isn't just about its greed, because let's face it, a lot of the exploitation of migrant workers comes down to greed. They exploit workers as much as they can because they can. But it's also a political issue, and that is that allowing workers to have bargaining rights in the UAE means allowing Emiratis to have rights, means allowing Emiratis to have association, means giving migrant workers the idea that they may have rights in the UAE, which is something that the UAE does not want, not for migrant workers and not for its own citizens. I think it's very important that in our discussion, we emphasize and understand that the abuse of workers in the UAE is not just about individual employers who are breaching the law. This is not a matter of the private sector abusing laws. This is about a system of exploitation that is built by the Emirati government, that is enforced by the Emirati government, that is maintained by the Emirati government, not only in the laws it chooses not to enforce, but in its refusal to allow workers to have rights, to have collective bargaining, to have freedom of association. And I think it's important to understand that simple fixes that we would require, that we benefit from, that we enjoy in many, many governments and countries around the world, like a minimum wage law, which is something that would make perfect sense for a country with a per capita as high as that, is something they refuse to do. To allow collective bargaining, union organizing, unionizing, something that workers enjoy the world over, the UAE refuses to do. So it's very important that we focus our recommendations first and foremost to the UAE government, which is doing everything it can to continue to squelch speech about this. Now, I know that the time is short and I don't want to go too long and preserve time. And I'm happy to discuss further some of the UAE's problematic human rights record, including the jailing of my friend Ahmed Mansour, who's been imprisoned for 10 years, over 10 years, and continues to remain in prison even though his sentence is expired. But I think we can save some of this for a more fulsome and robust discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And Sarah, we actually can't see you, so if you could just check your video camera is turned on. Otherwise, we'll get the technical team to check. But Sarah, again, thank you so much for your contributions. There's obviously so much to unpack in what you've said. As you mentioned as well, we'll have a brief period of the panelists discussing amongst ourselves. One thing, though, to really take away, I think, from what you and JJ have said is how closely linked, excuse me, trade union rights and freedom of association are to wider democratic freedoms, that the two things go hand in hand. And Sarah, you rightly pointed out that migrant workers particularly face exploitation in the Emirates. But in fact, the people of the Emirates themselves don't have civic freedoms. And, you know, if we're holding such an event as the COP climate process in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, I mean, let's be really clear. This is the event that's meant to be saving the planet and is about a just transition to building a better society, a more equitable society. Questions have to be raised, not just about the Emirates authorities, but also the United States government, its key allies, and international business. You know, there's virtually no major international business that does not have a significant presence in the Emirates. In our report, we actually mention 2 companies by name based on the evidence that we gathered. There are many others that we documented that we may consider releasing their names as well. And so, as Sarah, you've implied in what you've said, is there's a high degree of complicity in the entire international community, not just in the exploitation that the workers are facing in the Emirates, but in basically a co-opted climate process that is failing us. And it's really important to emphasize, it's also failing the people of the Emirates. Their own society will be devastated by climate change. So lots of things to discuss. I realize we don't have, obviously, a lot of time today to go through everything, but I wanted to just circle back to Cynthia and Mohammed. Firstly, you, Cynthia, you know, when we met, you talked very powerfully about how climate change has really devastated your community. You talked very powerfully about the horrible conditions you face in the Emirates, but could I first ask you just to talk about, you know, what was life like for you and your community? How was that impacted by climate change? Not sure, Cynthia, if you can hear me. Is this, maybe while the team works out the sound for Cynthia, maybe Mohammad Ali, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Hi, Mohammed. If I could turn to you while we're fixing Cynthia's connection, is to ask you that same question. If you could talk a little bit about, you know, you talked about the floods in 2010, how that really devastated the situation in your community. And ever since, you've had flash floods virtually every season. Could you talk a little bit about how that's affected jobs and businesses and people then being very desperate and therefore quite vulnerable to be exploited, taking jobs in the United Arab Emirates?
It's if everything is destroyed in the area and there's no requirement of food is there and requirement of shelter is there. So for the search of these things, my family members, as I have seen, migrate to the UAE. On the one day, if you see the houses and the buildings and everything, a very good infrastructure, and the second day, everything is destroyed. It makes the person to leave the area, leave the homeland and to migrate for the area to build there and reconstruct some of resources where the life could be exist simply. It's a threatened for my family members to be out of my country because it's very that they have lived their children, their fathers, their all of their family members, and then alone in the place where no one can know them and no one can hear them for them to help them. Yes.
And Mohammed, can you tell us, we have basically the world descending on Dubai in the Emirates in about 10 days' time to try to negotiate addressing climate change, including the Pakistan government, major businesses. What's your message to those people? What are workers, people from communities like yours, what is their message to the people going to Dubai in roughly a week's time?
I would like to expose my views that people, if in hurdle, could help them, whether it is from the countries or from the NGOs, from other sources. They should not be left alone because they get mentally tired. They are sick people because they can't get and they can't live with love to support each other. For that and for the sake of family support, they leave their places, their areas, and if a person leave, it's a very hurdle for him. It's a great with a lot of sorrows. He leave his children, his family, only for to get them food, to get them shelter, and to leave them with the good resources. This is a very sorrow moment for them, and the person here died, and he come from the abroad or from the other countries to see only how the fat structure is of him because they move after year, 2 year, 3 years. It's a very worry condition for the people to leave their homeland, whether it's good or bad, but it's theirs own property. And when he leaves them, that's because of a great moment for them to leave, because of to get some energy food, to get some food to sort to live with live within a good condition.
Thank you, Mohammed. Really, really appreciate that. And I think, what you touch on as well, and it's very hard to convey, is the human toll, the way that literally lives get destroyed. I've been doing human rights research for over 2 decades now, and, you always struggle to properly express the human qualities. But the one thing that has always struck me in the work that we do now, and particularly with this report, is when you speak to these people, they're really just like all of us. They're people that are trying to escape poverty. They're trying to improve their life. There's a hope for a better life in one of the wealthiest parts of the world. And, we're dealing right now at a time when there are so many human rights challenges out there, armed conflicts like the ones that Sarah mentioned. But we're dealing with something that can be solved. Workers that get paid, have dignity, that can build up their life, that they have a voice, that if you actually have an issue, because of your gender, your identity, or simply because of your job, that you can complain about that peacefully, constructively, without being punished. We're not talking about radical things. So I appreciate, Mohammed, for you expressing those really powerful things. I believe Cynthia can now hear us. Cynthia Nyaboke, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Brilliant. Sorry about that before. But just wanted to ask you, the question I had put to you before was if you could talk a little bit about the impacts of climate change that you personally and your community have faced And also similar to what Mohammed said is, how does that lead to the kind of desperation that makes people very vulnerable to exploitation?
Okay, thank you. So the climate, it just affects us because of the rain. So people lost their properties, their farm, you can't farm anything. And you find out people, you can't even save anything in the community because of the rain. And if you take a look of Dubai, the same rain, this heavy rain that you are facing through is the same towards there. They have like a lot of water and it just affects some people's homes. So you find that you lost everything. You can't save any cattle or any animals or even the house. You lost the food and you just left with nothing because of the weather, and the farm you can't because of too much water. And so that's why you find people are being driven to a safer way because of the water, because it causes a lot of many people lose their life. Yeah.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's funny when hearing you speak now, and also during the interviews that we did earlier with you, is it just makes you realize what a disgrace it is that they're having these peak climate conference in a place like the Emirates, and beyond the morality of it is how much it devastates the credibility. At a time where we're seeing globally around the world, people are so distrustful of governments, of authority, and when really basic demands that people are making. I remember when we spoke to Cynthia earlier, she talked about flash floods, that they did not even have time to take their belongings with them, and it sounded like they were leaving a war zone. And we're looking at, with the climate science, that this situation is going to get worse and it's going to impact all of us. So, today it's very hard to convey that, but we're dealing with literally a climate emergency, and our leaders are failing us. Again, we never have enough time to go through everything, but I just wanted to now pass to JJ a question for you. You did touch on this a little bit in your speech, but to talk to us a little bit about, why are labour rights critical to addressing climate change? I mean, it seems like a really obvious question, but I wonder whether, we think about reducing CO2 emissions, having more sustainable business practices, but why is labour rights particularly relevant to actually literally saving the planet?
Well, I think there's two key things. Can I do it from here?
I think we can hear.
Okay, two key things to mention here in a brief amount of time. The first is labor rights are critical because we need people like Cynthia and Mohammad Ali and all of the workers at the front lines of knowing what's going on, monitoring what's happening, helping us devise solutions, being at the table. We're not going to have a just transition without workers as a part of that. We can't, as everyone is saying here, we can't trust corporations and governments to do this alone. The second is that as this transition is happening and it's increasingly corporate captured, the solutions are going to make workers the subject of it as opposed to agents of change within it, and it's going to exacerbate inequality if we can't have workers with freedom of association and organizations pushing to have a just transition. That's the very definition of just transition.
Yeah, JJ, thanks for saying that. When you put it that way, it's really a no-brainer. It literally is a form of democracy in the workplace. It's the way that people are able, through their work experience, to talk about how these things are impacting them. And also just to emphasize the work that your organization does. It's so critical to promoting that. And very exciting what you mentioned about with the Biden administration, there's potentially an opportunity there, something to really emphasize, that there are solutions out there, as grim as things are. Sarah, I'd like to just turn to you very quickly, and a really simple question for you. We obviously know that the United Arab Emirates is a wealthy state, but it just seems such a fiasco that a country with such a poor human rights record is not only chairing the peak climate conference for the world, but also that the head of its delegation is literally the big oil and gas executive from the National Oil and Gas Company. We also heard from Senator Kerry, the climate envoy of the US government, actually heaping praise on Sultan Al Jaber, who is that person I mentioned. And Time magazine recently voted him one of the top 100 leaders on the climate transition. So the question for you, Sarah, is how did the UAE become such an influential player? Where is this all coming from? Not sure whether. Okay, Sarah, just asking if you can unmute your microphone. That's all right.
Sorry. I mean, I think there's one very, very, very obvious word for it, and that is money. We have a country with approximately 1 million citizens who control a chunk of the world's oil reserves and have extremely deep pockets of state wealth. One of the largest global investment funds, country national investment funds in the world. The UAE has used its economic leverage to extract political support. For many years, the UAE was the second largest weapons purchaser in the world and the second largest weapons purchaser from the United States. Unfortunately, our political officials are deeply compromised and beholden to the military-industrial complex, which encourages and rewards U.S. officials for approving arms sales. In exchange, of course, the United States has received what it always wants, first and foremost, from the UAE, and that is efforts to contain the price of oil, which of course it's failed to do in the past year, and we know that it is not the most important actor in OPEC, but also allowing for the presence of US forces on the ground and using the UAE as part of an attempted Arab-Sunni alliance against Iran. So there are political dimensions for the UAE's close relationship and influence, but I think wealth is the number one factor that has allowed it to attempt to buy sporting clubs, other prominent investment purchases, to sports wash and basically money wash its problematic human rights record, particularly in the wake of the war in Yemen. So I think those are some of the factors. But getting in on the COP28 game, of course, is a way to raise its global prominence as a major player in the world, just like the Expo, just like the construction of Saadiyat Island, bringing in the world's most famous museums like the Guggenheim and the Louvre, basically to sanitize its image as a net positive actor on the world stage, while at the same time using its influence at COP28 to ensure that there is nothing on the table about restricting the extraction of fossil fuels. So they are happy to dance around every issue on climate, every remedy except the number one most essential remedy, which is to limit the extraction of fossil fuels. And that is something that hits their bottom line. That is the basis of their global influence and wealth. And so that is something that they are prohibiting basically the entire planet from doing so that they don't have to do.
Thanks, Sarah. You know, what you've talked about there is a matter of money, a matter of power and politics. These seem like such significant challenges. You obviously work on other deeper, very challenging civic freedom issues in that region. You know, are there any pauses for hope? And what are the things that, whether we're in the United States or in other parts of the world with particularly democratic governments, what should we be doing to try to confront this naked power?
Well, the good thing about the issues of migrant workers and labor protections is that many of them are really just purely economic issues that the UAE can afford to fix. They don't bleed into the larger political issues. I suspect that allowing workers' collective bargaining and unionization will remain off the table with the UAE because it has such deep implications for the undemocratic dictatorial nature of its government, where even Emiratis have no voice in their government. Even Emiratis cannot vote on anything. But issues like working conditions, like even a minimum wage, like the kafala system, which continues to operate, like the failed enforcement of federal housing laws and recruiting laws that are supposed to prohibit the very abuses that you've amply documented. I think those can be remedied, and they can be remedied by the Emirati government, and they will be remedied by the Emirati government if organizations like Equidem keep up the pressure and keep up exposing the abuses that workers are subject to, which should basically start costing them more and should cost them more that the money they're spending to sanitize their image through PR firms and lobbyists and the purchase of vanity projects like sporting teams and whatnot. I think that they can be pressured on a lot of these issues because ultimately it's just about them paying, and their businesses paying a few pennies more to build the gleaming towers, to build these supposed environment-friendly projects. And so I think it is some of the most vitally important work that we can be doing to focus on migrant workers, as Equidem is doing, because I do think that we can continue to extract concessions from the Emirati government and very significantly push them to enforce their own laws, which should be embarrassing for them as a state that is unable to govern, unable to enforce its own laws.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think, that does give us that sort of hope that, our efforts can make a difference. And I think it's like any human rights issue, right? In any situation that we can think of where there has been a human rights victory, it so often feels like nothing can be done. And then, of course, things do change, and it is about the power. So maybe I can turn to you, JJ. Similar question. It's also a question that we've received online, and I think Sarah touched on it too. And that is, what are the ways in which the US and the UAE can work together towards ensuring the rights of low-wage migrant workers are upheld, given their close diplomatic ties?
Well, I think that the executive memorandum released last week presents a roadmap for how the U.S. can increasingly engage and prioritize labor rights concerns in the context. That means when U.S. officials visit the UAE, they are directed to meet with affected workers. They are directed to have knowledge of and get knowledge of, including through things like Equidem's report, the actual conditions on the ground for workers. And I think they're directed to make this a priority in U.S. policy conversations. So I think that there's very specific both how it should happen and the prioritization of labor rights issues that should be happening. And so we look forward to seeing how this affects the U.S. delegation to COP28 and other future engagements with the UAE.
Yeah, and I should point out that your organisation, mine, Dawn, Mina as well, and other organisations have been very actively engaging with the US government, other civil society actors that are going to the COP conference. So certainly this really is only the beginning of the work that we're all collectively doing around this issue. So we've only got about 5-10 minutes left for any audience questions. We have received a couple on Zoom, but I wondered whether, thank you to those of you who came nice and early on a Monday morning to be with us. I wondered whether anyone had any questions around the report or anything that has been said today. Really open for you to ask any questions if you have that. And not to put you on the spot, but wondered if anyone had any questions they want to ask. There are some from online that I can also go to while you're sort of reflecting. So one question that we have got from online, unless there's any questions here, is I think it's directed to me and Equidem, is you've done some amazing research over the past few years. How would you compare the difficulties in collecting information in the United Arab Emirates versus the other countries you have worked in? Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. So one thing to say at the outset is that, we are a human rights organization. So that means is our research is done using human rights methodologies. And the key plank of that, although there are many, is around duty of care to the people that are in your team, to the people that you might meet. So for us, the most important thing is safety, and we take that very seriously. I think I can speak on behalf of the entire team to say that there is no more challenging place to do this kind of a labour rights investigation, perhaps with the exception of perhaps North Korea and Xinjiang in China, than the United Arab Emirates. It is a deeply hostile place and a very sophisticated actor. There's a high amount of digital surveillance. And the key thing for us, of course, is that virtually every aspect of what someone does in the Emirates is tracked. And so something that over several years, we've really developed our specialism in investigating that country. The thing that really has struck me, though, is the incredible fear and sometimes terror that workers face when they are approached to talk about what they're facing. Like I mentioned to you earlier, we had discussions with 248 workers. We had detailed interviews with 102. And the reason for that is really simple, is that most of the workers we approached were very uncomfortable speaking to us. So it is an extremely challenging environment to be doing this kind of research. But at the same time, in fact, there is a lot of information. And what has always struck us is that when you do create these safe spaces for workers to talk, they're very, very willing to speak. So it's a really great question. It's a huge challenge. I would also say that echoing what others have said is it's why it's so important that we really push back on the Emirates, ask questions. Please read our report. Share it with your colleagues, your networks, your family and friends. The Emirates is also a really big holiday and travel destination. So it's something to really bear in mind. And of course, if you are aware of any information, if you're familiar with the region, please do get in touch with us. We'll provide our contact details to you. Just one final thing as well on that to say is that I really wanted to emphasize, if it's not clear, just how much courage it takes Muhammad Ali and Cynthia to join us today. They are safely back in their home countries, but nevertheless, it takes a lot of courage for ordinary common people from beautiful but very impoverished parts of the world to speak out about the most powerful people. And that is what we see ultimately as our role as Equidem, is to try to give a voice to those people, but also to provide solutions, to talk about what are things that we can do about these things and not just complain about problems. So I hope that we've been able to convey that to you today. Like I said, our journey begins now. It hasn't ended now. There's so much more work to be done. And there's no cause that's more just and more significant than literally saving our planet. And what our work today has shown is that there's a direct link between climate change and our failures on climate change and how the workers who are the backbone of the global economy are being treated. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining, whether here in DC or online. I really appreciate that. And with that, we'll close the launch. Thank you so much for joining today.